The V5900 is somewhat of a relic of a bygone card generation. The very last Terascale GPU that ran on 75 watts. It also used to have this huge metal handle, which was thankfully removable, and now becomes a much more minimalistic and still rather large 75 watt card. But this card being over a decade old, and its last driver update was almost 5 years ago, can you still play games on the V5900? Starting off with Overwatch, and we're in the upper 30s, low 40s for FPS, which if you ask any Switch owner is definitely playable, but probably not ideal in this case. You can thankfully lower down the resolution scaling down to auto, and that will get you somewhere in the 50 to 60 FPS range. I'm not sure exactly why it doesn't go all the way up to 60. You can get 60 FPS if you reduce the scaling manually, but you can see the 600 megahertz clock speed really coming in here. Dirt 3 is an old game at this point, but it is still newer than this card, and at low settings, 1080p, we're still above 60 FPS all the time, at least in this particular instance. And luckily, low settings in this game actually looks pretty good. We don't have to go down to ultra low, which turns off most everything, so yeah, it's not a bad experience. Torchlight 2 runs surprisingly well on this card, usually going down into the 60 FPS range, maybe a little below that when we're in more intense combat, but running at the 80 to 100 FPS most of the other times. It is a surprisingly bright spot in this whole review. At highest quality settings, 1080p, there is nothing stopping you from playing Torchlight 2 on the V5900. Sonic Generations is originally an Xbox 360 PS3 game, and it actually holds up pretty well even today. Although on this card, you can't achieve 60 FPS at 1080p. Even at the lowest possible settings, which are not really that low, really, we're still more in the 40 to 45 FPS range. Dropping down into 720p would get you all the way to 60 FPS, though. The last official driver updates for this card came out in 2017, and do you know what is newer than 2017? Control, and it shows. We're going to be somewhere at the 19 FPS, 16 FPS range at 540p on minimum settings. Yeah, it is not a good experience. It doesn't look good, it doesn't play good, it's not responsive enough to even say that you could, muster through it. It's not a good experience at this point, and it's kind of like the turning point in this particular video that newer games are not going to perform well on this card. And besides the fact that they're newer games and they're more intensive games, the lack of driver updates really starts hampering the experience, and in some cases makes the games completely unplayable. Speaking of unplayable, Unity games. Pretty much any modern Unity game is completely unplayable on this card. Unplayable in the fact that they don't even load up, so there isn't even FPS for me to report. You get nothing on screen. You can still hear the game working in the background, but there's nothing generated on the screen. You just get either an empty box or like a window that has nothing in it. It just doesn't work. So Timberborn, Super Auto Pets, which is a 2D game, Townscaper, Temtem, none of these games work on this card. So I would assume any game developed in Unity in the last couple years would not be compatible, which is a little bit of a shame because newer games that aren't built in Unity still continue to play, albeit at low quality settings. Rollout is still in early access, but at 1080p with a 33% resolution modifier and low settings, it plays above 60 FPS on this card. And despite low being an overall big downgrade in visual quality, the overall simplistic geometry holds up pretty well with even this low resolution. Lost Ark is a 2022 game, and that still plays okay on this card. At 1080p, low quality settings, and 30 FPS, it's not necessarily something that you would write home about, but it is still rather impressive that it works well in this game at all. If you were to go down to 720p, you could get a little bit more of a stable frame rate, and unfortunately there is not a inbuilt frame cap, so you can't, make it 30 FPS at all times if you wanted to have like a smooth 30 FPS experience. But you could always do that in the drivers, although the drivers don't really work with Windows 11. And that kind of also brings me into a whole other thing. This card does not support secure boot, meaning you can't actually view, the startup sequence. You can't go into the BIOS, and nothing actually displays on screen until you get into Windows. And you won't actually see anything in Windows unless you've already installed the driver for this card. So you'll need a second card or some other integrated graphics in order to install the drivers to make this card work in Windows 11. So yeah, it plays games in 2022, but with so many different caveats, it's not something I would recommend to anybody. Even if you got it for a steal for $5, $1 free, it is probably not what you were looking for, especially when there are many other low-power GPUs that are much newer in architecture that will have longer driver support, such as even the W5900, which I just did a video on, which, while it may not be much faster than this card, is an overall better value since it supports more modern drivers and is usually actually cheaper to buy than the V5900.